Camp Hearn, Texas. August 1943. The heat arrived before anything else. It came off the land in visible waves, bending the air above the railroad tracks, turning the flat Texas horizon into something liquid and uncertain. Werner Haas stepped off the transport train into that heat and stood for a moment with his eyes closed, letting it press against his face like a hand. He was 28 years old. He had survived North Africa. He had survived the collapse of the Afrika Korps at Tunisia. He had survived the processing centers outside Carthage, the holding camp at Oran, the transport ship with its gray-painted hull and its smell of diesel and unwashed men, and 12 days in the Atlantic with nothing to do but calculate probabilities he preferred not to calculate. He had not expected to survive what came next. Every prisoner who had made the crossing carried the same information inside them, packed as tightly as the propaganda posters that had lined the walls of every barracks, every mess hall, every administrative building from Berlin to Tunis. The Americans were brutal. The Americans were barbaric. The Americans treated prisoners as animals, as the raw material of suffering, as the rightful recipients of every cruelty that the Reich had spent years warning its soldiers to expect. Joseph Goebbels had built that understanding with the precision of an architect, brick by careful brick, over years of broadcasts and posters and carefully calibrated accounts of American behavior that had circulated through the Wehrmacht the way all institutional knowledge circulates, by repetition until it becomes indistinguishable from fact. Werner had absorbed it. He had absorbed it not because he was ideologically fervent, which he was not, but because he was practical, and practical men accept institutional knowledge when the institution providing it is the only institution available. He had crossed an ocean prepared for what the institution had promised him. He stood on the platform and waited for the brutality to begin. Sergeant Earl Novak appeared at the edge of the platform. He was 38 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the unhurried movements of a man who has spent most of his life working with his hands and has learned that the work goes better when you don't rush it. Before the war, he had been a machinist in Davenport, Iowa, operating equipment in a manufacturing plant that produced agricultural implements and, later, components for things the war required. He understood systems. He understood the relationship between a well-maintained tool and a job done correctly. He had applied this understanding to Camp Hearn's prisoner intake procedures the same way he applied it to everything else, with methodical attention and without personal investment in the outcome. He held a folded bundle of clothing. He walked to Werner without particular urgency and held it out. Werner took it. The cloth was khaki, pressed and folded with military precision, the creases sharp and even. Werner brought it to his face, the automatic gesture of a man who has learned over 2 years of increasingly scarce supply to assess what he was given before committing to trusting it. He stopped. He breathed in. Real soap. Not the gray crumbling ersatz blocks that his regiment had been issued at 1 bar per month for 8 men, the soap that had to be rationed by duration of use rather than quantity, that left a residue on the skin regardless of how long you rinsed. Not the synthetic substitute that smelled of chemical processes and never quite convinced the nose that it was soap rather than something aspiring to be soap. This was real soap, the kind that had vanished from Stuttgart in the winter of 1941, when the supply chains began their long contraction. The kind his mother had kept in the back of the kitchen cupboard and rationed in smaller and smaller quantities until the day, sometime in 1942, when the rationing became pointless because there was nothing left to ration. Werner stood on the platform in the Texas heat with a folded khaki uniform against his face, and for a long moment he was not a prisoner of war on a railway platform in Robertson County, Texas. He was in his mother's kitchen in Stuttgart, and the light was coming through the window at the late afternoon angle he had always associated with home, and everything that had happened between then and now was something he was about to wake up from. He did not wake up. He lowered the uniform and looked at the flat Texas landscape spread around him. Along the fence line of Camp Hearn, someone had strung a series of clotheslines between wooden posts. On those lines hung sheets, white sheets, impossibly, aggressively white, brilliant in the August sun, snapping in the dry Texas wind with a clean flat sound like the turning of a page in a very large book. There were dozens of them, perhaps more, stretching along the fence in both directions, moving in the wind with the casual abundance of things that are produced in sufficient quantity that no one has needed to think carefully about their allocation. Werner Haas had fought across 3 countries. He had seen artillery reduce buildings to powder in under a minute. He had watched supply sergeants make calculations about ammunition with the desperation of people who know the numbers will eventually not add up. He had learned to measure everything by scarcity. How much water, how much fuel, how much soap, how many bullets, how many days until the situation became untenable. He had internalized the arithmetic of insufficiency so thoroughly that he had stopped noticing he was doing it. He looked at those white sheets and understood something that no artillery barrage had ever taught him. A nation that could afford to keep its enemy's laundry brilliantly white was a nation that had already won. Not winning. Already won. Past tense. Decided. The war he had been fighting was a war against an arithmetic he had not been permitted to see clearly, and those white sheets, snapping in the August wind above a prisoner of war camp in the Texas flatlands, were the first honest number he had encountered in years. He did not say this. He did not say anything. He filed it where he filed all the things that needed more time than the present moment allowed, in the part of his mind where difficult calculations sat until the rest of the situation caught up with them. He carried his folded uniform and followed Novak through the gate. The records are specific about Camp Hearn. According to files preserved in Record Group 389 at the National Archives in Washington, the facility held 4,800 German prisoners of war at its operational peak in the summer of 1943. It occupied 430 acres of flat central Texas land outside the town of Hearn, in Robertson County, built to military specification with rows of wooden barracks, a medical facility equipped beyond what most German soldiers had access to in the field, administrative buildings, a recreation area, and a laundry operation that processed more than 240,000 pounds of fabric per month. The daily caloric provision for each prisoner, mandated by the Geneva Convention and documented in the records of the Office of the Provost Marshal General, was 3,400 calories per day. For reference, by the summer of 1943, the standard civilian ration in a major German city had been reduced to approximately 1,500 calories per day. For soldiers on active service in secondary theaters, it was sometimes less. Werner Haas had spent his last months in North Africa calculating how to divide inadequate supplies among men who needed more than the supplies could provide, watching the division between what was needed and what was available grow wider with each passing month until the division became the story of the entire campaign. He was now a prisoner of the enemy, and he was going to be fed better than he had eaten since 1941. He did not know this yet when he followed Novak through the gate. He learned it at breakfast the following morning. The mess hall was a long wooden building, clean and plain, with windows along both sides that let in the morning light and the smell of the Texas air. Werner sat at a table and a tray was placed in front of him by a mess worker who did this with the automatic efficiency of a man who has placed trays in front of many people and given it no more thought than the task requires. Werner looked at the tray for a long moment before he understood what he was seeing. Scrambled eggs. Real eggs. Not the powdered substitute that had characterized the last year of his military life, the pale yellow powder that reconstituted into something that resembled eggs in shape and approximate color and nothing else. These were real eggs, scrambled and slightly soft in the middle, with a smell that belonged to his memory of mornings before the war. Bacon, cooked through and brown at the edges, the fat rendered down the way it renders when heat is applied without urgency, when there is enough fuel to take the time. Toast, white bread, with a small container of butter beside it. Real butter in a quantity sufficient for the toast without requiring the kind of careful spreading that turns a luxury into an exercise in restraint. A tin cup of coffee with cream and sugar available on the table, in containers not rationed, not measured, simply available to be used according to preference. Werner sat very still. He had been a practical man before the war, and the war had made him more practical, stripping away the habits and assumptions of ordinary life until what remained was the efficient, calculating attention of someone who has learned to notice everything and waste nothing. He applied this attention to the tray in front of him with the same precision he applied to everything. He picked up the fork and took one bite of the scrambled eggs. He chewed slowly and swallowed. He put the fork down and looked at the tray again. The food was still there. It had not been staged for some official purpose, some demonstration for visiting inspection. It was simply breakfast. It happened he would learn every morning. Every single morning, regardless of what was happening in Europe or anywhere else, regardless of the news from the fronts or the logistics of supply chains or any of the other variables that had governed the availability of food in every context Werner had inhabited for the past 3 years. He ate the rest of it in silence, methodically, without rushing, the way a man eats when he is simultaneously hungry and thinking, and when he set the fork down for the last time he began, in the careful and systematic way of a trained engineer encountering data that does not fit the existing model, to understand that something about his fundamental understanding of the world was wrong. He carried the tray to the return station and walked back to the barracks and sat on his bunk and thought about that for a long time. 3 weeks after Werner arrived at Camp Hearn, a second group of prisoners was processed through the facility's intake procedures. Among them was Erich Sommer. Erich was 35 years old, a Feldwebel, a career non-commissioned officer from Hamburg who had served in France in 1940 and then in North Africa with the 90th Light Division until the campaign's end. He had the particular quality of a man who has performed difficult work for a long time and has arrived at a stable equilibrium with the difficulty. Not enthusiastic, not defeated, simply functional in the way that long experience with the gap between expectation and reality produces in people who are fundamentally practical. He had the veteran cynicism, which is different from the civilian cynicism in the same way that scar tissue is different from uninjured skin. Both are the result of the same substance under different circumstances. One has been tested. He arrived at Camp Hearn with his conclusions firmly in place. The soap was propaganda. The food was propaganda. The clean uniforms and the adequate facilities and the general condition of adequacy that surrounded him from the moment he arrived. All of it propaganda. The Americans wanted German prisoners to write letters home describing their comfortable captivity, to plant seeds of demoralization in the civilian population, to undermine confidence in the Reich's narrative that the war was going well. He had watched enough of Goebbels's operations to recognize the structure of a psychological campaign when he was inside one. This was a psychological campaign. It would reveal its manufactured nature in time. He said this to Werner on his 3rd evening at Camp Hearn, sitting on the wooden bench outside the barracks in the cooling Texas evening. Werner listened without arguing. He had been thinking about the sheets on the clotheslines for 3 weeks by then, turning the arithmetic over in his mind with the thoroughness of an engineer who does not release a calculation until it has been checked from every available angle. The thing that broke Erich's theory was not grand. It was not designed to break theories. It was, in fact, not designed at all. It was a bar of soap. On his 4th morning at Camp Hearn, Erich Sommer received his weekly personal issue of soap as part of the camp's standard prisoner provision. 1 full bar. His alone. Not shared among 8 men according to a rotation that required tracking and negotiation and the specific social friction that develops when 8 people have to share 1 bar of something. Not a fragment of a bar, the residue of someone else's previous week. A complete, full-sized bar of real American soap, white and firm and slightly waxy and smelling of the particular clean scent that Werner had identified on the platform and that Erich's nose now identified without being asked for a verdict. He carried it to the shower block that evening. The showers ran hot water. Not lukewarm, which is what happens when a heating system is working against the constraint of limited fuel. Hot. Heated by the camp's electrical system, which drew power from the Texas grid, which drew power from generating stations whose capacity had been built to serve a population accustomed to using electricity as a matter of routine rather than as a carefully rationed resource. The hot water was not a decision anyone at Camp Hearn made each day. It simply happened the way things happen in systems with room to spare. Erich stood under the hot water with the bar of soap in his hands. He thought of his wife in Hamburg. Her name was Margaret. They had 2 sons, 7 and 9 years old, whom he had last seen in the autumn of 1942 when he had been home on leave before the regiment shipped to North Africa. Hamburg had been bombed in late July, a series of raids the Allies were calling Operation Gamara, raids that had created a firestorm in the city's densely packed residential districts, a wall of fire that moved faster than people could run from it. Erich had heard about the raids from new prisoners who arrived in August, men who had been in Germany more recently and who carried the information in the specific way that people carry information about disasters, with the completeness of detail that comes from trying to understand something by recounting it, and the incompleteness that comes from the fact that some things do not yield to recounting. He did not know if his family had survived. He had written letters through the Red Cross channels and received nothing in return, which could mean many things, most of which he preferred not to think about while there was still a reasonable possibility that silence was an artifact of the mail system rather than of the situation in Hamburg. He knew, with the knowledge that does not require confirmation, that in Hamburg, if Margaret was alive and his sons were alive, she was washing those boys in cold water with soap made from ash and rendered animal fat, the improvised soap that had replaced real soap in cities across Germany as the supply chains contracted and the available chemistry was redirected toward what the war required. He knew this because he had seen her doing it during his last leave, when the real soap was already running short, and he had not said anything about it because there was nothing useful to say. He stood under the hot water of the Camp Hern shower block, holding a full bar of real American soap between his palms, and he wept. Not loudly, not with the drama of a man who has decided to express something, with the controlled, almost silent precision of a man who has spent years maintaining an exterior that does not reveal what is happening inside it, and for whom weeping is not an expression but a physiological event that happens despite the maintenance. His shoulders did not shake. His face did not contort. His eyes simply filled, and the water on his cheeks was both the shower and the tears, and the two were indistinguishable. Propaganda does not make a man weep in a shower. Evidence does. He finished the shower and dried himself and put on his clean khaki uniform and walked back to the barracks in the Texas evening and sat on his bunk and said nothing to Werner. Werner looked at him once. He did not ask. He had been at Camp Hern for 3 weeks by then and had already learned that certain silences are more informative than any conversation could be, and that asking questions is often a way of interrupting understanding rather than advancing it. He went back to his letter, which he was composing in the careful, indirect language of a man who knows that every word will be read by people who are not the intended recipient, and who has learned to say things that are true without saying things that will be removed. The laundry facility sat toward the eastern end of Camp Hern's main compound, a long building with a corrugated metal roof and double doors wide enough to accommodate industrial equipment being moved in or out. It was not architecturally distinguished. It was a functional building designed for a functional purpose, built to military specification, which meant it was solid and adequate and no more than that. Werner found it on his second full day at the camp, following the sound of machinery he could hear from 2 barracks over but could not immediately identify. The sound was rhythmic and mechanical, the sound of something large moving against itself in a controlled way, and it was familiar in a general sense without being familiar in a specific sense, which meant his engineering mind filed it under the category of industrial equipment operating and began walking toward it before he had consciously decided to investigate. He stood in the doorway and looked. 6 washing machines stood in a row along the left wall. They were Maytag machines, manufactured at the company's main facility in Newton, Iowa, built for commercial and industrial laundry operations in hotels, hospitals, and institutions that processed large volumes of fabric regularly. They had white enamel exteriors and chrome fittings that caught the light from the windows above them. Each machine was approximately the size of a small automobile. Each could process 50 pounds of laundry per cycle. Hot water ran to them through copper pipes that entered through the left wall and connected to the machine's intake valves with the clean, precise fittings of plumbing done by someone who knew what they were doing and had the materials to do it correctly. Werner walked to the nearest machine and put his hand on the enamel surface. He stood there for a moment with his palm flat against the white enamel, feeling the vibration of the drum moving inside, the heat of the water transmitted through the machine's shell, the specific solidity of something built to commercial specification rather than wartime expedience. He was an engineer. He had spent his professional life before the war designing and assessing mechanical systems, evaluating their capacity, their efficiency, their relationship to the industrial context that had produced them. He brought that trained attention to the Maytag machine in the Camp Hern laundry facility the same way he would have brought it to any piece of equipment he was asked to assess. He would learn the full context later, from conversation with other prisoners and from documents that occasionally circulated through the camp. The Maytag company had been converting its production lines to manufacture components for military aircraft, a conversion that the American war production system was executing across hundreds of manufacturing facilities simultaneously as it redirected industrial capacity toward what the war required. The washing machines in the Camp Hern laundry facility were surplus from before the conversion, equipment that could not be adapted for war production quickly enough to justify the retooling cost, and that therefore had been distributed to prisoner of war camps as a practical solution to the problem of what to do with industrial laundry equipment that the war production system had no immediate use for. He worked through the implications of this with the systematic attention of a man doing an assessment. The United States had so much industrial capacity that it had more commercial laundry equipment than it could find uses for in its war production. The machines were not a luxury. They were not a deliberate provision of comfort. They were surplus, redirected to a use that required no additional investment because the investment had already been made in the course of ordinary commercial life. And the solution to the problem of surplus washing machines, in the calculation of the American military administration, was to give them to the enemy. Germany had entered the war with impressive production statistics. Werner had believed in those statistics the way a man believes in the load-bearing capacity of the floor he is standing on. Not because he has verified it personally, but because the institution he inhabits has verified it and he has accepted the institution's verification. But Germany's production numbers were Germany extracting every possible unit of output from every available resource, squeezing and rationing and prioritizing and calculating. An economy stretched taut across its own limits with no margin for anything that was not essential. America did not squeeze. America poured. Werner had understood this in an abstract way since the butter at breakfast. Standing in front of the Maytag machine with his palm on the enamel, he understood it in the specific, mechanical, irrefutable way that engineers understand things when the evidence is not a number on a page but a physical object under their hand. He counted the machines. 6. He estimated the daily throughput, accounting for cycle time and loading and the realistic operational capacity of the equipment. He multiplied by the number of prisoners in the facility. He compared the result to his knowledge of his own division's laundry capacity in the field, the buckets and the ration soap and the water that had to be sourced and heated by whatever means were available. Camp Hearn's laundry operation processed more fabric in a single day than his entire division had managed in a month. He stood in front of the machines for a while longer. Then he went back to his barracks, lay on his bunk, and stared at the wooden ceiling. He put his hands behind his head and looked at the pine boards, rough-cut and still faintly smelling of the sawmill, assembled with American lumber in American quantities because there was enough lumber to build prisoner-of-war camps to a standard that Germany would have considered adequate for its own administrative facilities. And he began, very carefully, to construct the picture that the individual pieces had been assembling toward since the moment he stepped off the train. Tobias Wren had arrived on the same transport as Werner, but Werner did not learn his name until the second week. He was 21 years old, thin and quick-moving, with the particular alertness of someone who has spent recent time in circumstances where not paying attention had immediate consequences. He had been a Luftwaffe pilot, flying Messerschmitt Bf 109s out of Sicilian airfields until an Allied P-38 had found him at altitude on a clear morning in July with no clouds to use and no altitude advantage left to exploit. He had survived the bailout with a dislocated shoulder and a long cut along his left forearm from something he never fully identified, possibly the canopy frame, and had been processed through 3 different transit facilities before arriving at Camp Hearn with the slightly unfocused quality of someone who has moved through too many temporary places in too short a time and has not yet found a fixed point to orient from. He was 21 years old. He had enlisted at 18 and had no adult experience of the world that did not involve the war. Everything he understood about how things worked, he had learned inside a military structure that was itself operating inside a war economy, which meant that everything he understood about how things worked was shaped by scarcity and substitution and the constant adjustment of expectation downward toward what was actually available. Werner noticed him because of the machines. Tobias could not stop touching things. Not only the washing machines, though the washing machines were where Werner first noticed the behavior. The plumbing fixtures. The electrical switches on the barracks walls. The door hinges on the mess hall, which were heavy-duty commercial hinges of the kind used in institutional construction, precisely cast and properly installed, without the improvised quality that Werner had come to associate with hardware in wartime contexts. Tobias touched these things with 2 fingers, carefully, tentatively, in the specific way that you touch something when you are not entirely certain it will behave the way it appears it should behave. Werner watched this for several days without saying anything, cataloging it with the same attention he applied to everything at Camp Hearn, before he understood what he was observing. Tobias was checking if it was real. He was 21. He had no adult memory of a world in which things worked reliably because there was enough material to make them work reliably. For him, the equipment and plumbing and hinges of Camp Hearn were not nostalgic objects, not reminders of a pre-war world he remembered. They were simply impossible. They belonged to a category of things that should not exist, and the fact that they appeared to exist required verification through direct physical contact. Werner found him one morning crouched beside the nearest Maytag machine, examining the copper pipe fitting where the hot water supply line connected to the machine's intake valve. The fitting was well made. Clean solder joint, proper alignment, no signs of the improvised repair or the expedient substitution that had characterized the infrastructure Werner had worked with and around for the past 2 years. Werner crouched beside him. "It holds," Werner said. Tobias looked at him. "I know. That's what I can't understand." Werner said nothing. There was nothing to add. That was precisely it. The problem was not that the fitting might fail under pressure. The problem was that it wouldn't, and that the reason it wouldn't was not exceptional skill or exceptional care but simply the application of an adequate standard to an adequate material supply. The fitting was done correctly because doing it correctly was what doing it meant. Sergeant Novak was teaching Tobias to play baseball in the recreation yard on a Thursday afternoon when Werner walked by on his way back from the laundry facility. Novak had set up a basic hitting station with a bat and a worn baseball, and was explaining the grip and stance with the patient, iterative approach of a man who understands that physical skills are transmitted through demonstration and correction rather than through description. He showed Tobias the grip. He showed him the stance. He positioned Tobias's elbow, stepped back, and threw a soft pitch from 10 feet. Tobias connected. The ball arced into the open area of the recreation yard in a clean line, traveling further than the throw that had produced it. Novak watched it land and nodded once, the minimal nod of a man confirming that a principle has been correctly applied. Werner stood at the edge of the yard and observed the lesson and then observed Hauptmann Felix Grauer, who was standing 20 feet away and also observing, with an expression Werner had spent several weeks learning to read. Grauer was 46 years old, a panzer officer from Munich who had commanded armored units in Italy with the professional competence of a man who knows his trade and the ideological firmness of a man who has built his identity around a set of beliefs that he has spent years not testing against contrary evidence. He had survived the war thus far through a combination of genuine military skill and the specific resilience of people whose framework for understanding events is sufficiently comprehensive to absorb any data point without requiring modification. The soap was propaganda. The food was psychological warfare. The washing machines were a calculated display of industrial capacity designed to demoralize. Nothing at Camp Hearn was, for Grauer, simply what it appeared to be. He watched Novak teach Tobias baseball with the expression of a man watching something that offends him in ways he cannot quite articulate, in ways that he suspects say more about him than about the thing being observed. Werner watched Grauer watch the lesson and thought about a conversation he had overheard the previous afternoon. Tobias had asked Novak, with the directness of a 21-year-old who has not yet fully developed the social instinct that prevents direct questions, why the Americans treated their prisoners well. Novak had considered the question for a moment. He had the deliberate quality of a man who thinks before speaking, who has learned through long experience that most things worth saying require a moment to form correctly. He said, "Because we can." 3 words. Werner had been turning them over since then, examining them from different angles the way an engineer examines a component he does not immediately recognize, looking for the mechanism, looking for what the words implied about the system that had produced them. Not because we were required to, though the Geneva Convention required it and Camp Hearn followed the Geneva Convention with bureaucratic precision. Not because of humanitarian impulse, though Novak was not unkind. Because we can. Capacity expressed as behavior. The surplus made visible in the daily functioning of the facility. The washing machines were not generosity. They were the casual deployment of what was left over after the war's actual requirements had been met. The butter at breakfast was not charity. It was the visible margin of an agricultural system so productive that feeding prisoners well required no particular sacrifice from anyone. The hot water in the showers was not a gift. It was what happened when you had enough electrical generating capacity that heating shower water for prisoners was not a calculation worth making. Werner stood at the edge of the recreation yard and thought. Germany fought this war as though fighting hard enough could overcome the arithmetic. Cannot. It never can. The arithmetic is the war. The fighting is what the arithmetic permits. He walked back to the barracks and sat on his bunk and put his hands flat on his knees and looked at the far wall. The wall was plain and clean and straight, assembled by American labor with American lumber in quantities that had not required anyone to make difficult decisions about what to build and what to forego. It was simply a wall. It held. It would continue to hold because there was no particular pressure on it, no shortage of material that had required expedience in its construction, no calculation that had resulted in its being built to a standard lower than what the situation required. Werner Haas, 28 years old, KY Suko Kai from Stuttgart, former Unteroffizier of the Wehrmacht's 334th Infantry Division, prisoner of the United States Army at Camp Hearn, Texas, sat on his bunk in the August heat and began the long and difficult work of fully understanding what the wall meant. Outside, the white sheets snapped on the clotheslines in the Texas wind. Numbers do not require witnesses to be true. By December, a routine had established itself at Camp Hearn with the organic inevitability of routines that form in any enclosed population over time. The mornings began with the mess hall, which Werner attended with the regularity of a man who has decided to observe something thoroughly rather than selectively. The food was consistent, not spectacular, not varied in ways that required imagination, but consistent. Adequate calories, adequate protein, adequate everything, the provision of adequacy as a baseline rather than as an achievement. Werner ate his breakfast every morning and noted its contents with the same attention he brought to all his observations, not because the contents changed significantly from day to day, but because consistency was itself data, and the data accumulated. He worked in the laundry facility most mornings, assigned there when he listed his occupation as mechanical engineer on the intake form. He operated the machines, monitored temperatures, kept the equipment in the calibrated working order that his training told him machines should be kept in. He was good at it, and the goodness was not performance. He was constitutionally incapable of doing mechanical work badly, regardless of context. Tobias worked grounds maintenance, which kept him outside in the autumn air and gave his restless energy somewhere to go. Eric was assigned to kitchen assistance, which put him in proximity to the food supply and which he approached with the dispassionate efficiency of a man performing a task that requires no emotional engagement and therefore receives none. Grauer circulated. He had no assigned work detail that Werner could identify, or if he had one he performed it invisibly and spent the remainder of his time moving through the camp with the watchful attention of a commanding officer assessing the condition of troops, which was perhaps how he understood what he was doing. The evenings Grauer used for what he called discussions. They happened in the corner of barracks 7 after the lights had been dimmed, when the men had the specific restlessness of people with nowhere to go and nothing required of them, which is the condition most conducive to listening to someone who has something to say. Grauer sat at the end of a bunk and spoke about the Reich's industrial expansion, about the Panzer program's accelerating output, about the wonder weapons that were further along than the Allies understood, about the strategic retreats that were in fact repositioning rather than defeat, about the calculation of overall advantage that looked different when you had access to the full picture rather than the partial picture that prisoners necessarily inhabited. Werner attended twice. He sat in the back and listened and said nothing. On the third evening he stayed in his barracks and lay on his bunk and looked at the pine ceiling and thought about the Maytag machines from Newton, Iowa, which had been made surplus by a conversion to aircraft component manufacturing that was itself only one of hundreds of similar conversions happening simultaneously across the American industrial landscape. He thought about what it meant that the overflow from that conversion was washing his laundry. He thought about what it meant that this was not exceptional, that it was ordinary. Grauer's descriptions of wonder weapons and strategic advantages were descriptions of a nation squeezing. Werner had watched a nation squeeze for 3 years. He was now inside a nation that was pouring, and the difference between the two was not a matter of degree. It was a matter of category. He did not go to any more of Grauer's evenings. Autumn came to central Texas without drama. The heat withdrew gradually, the way a tide pulls back from a shore that it will return to. The sky deepened from the flat white blue of August into something richer. The cottonwood trees along the western perimeter fence dropped their leaves in stages, one section before another, so that for several weeks in October the fence line was a patchwork of gold and bare branch and late-holding green. The clotheslines continued regardless of season. White sheets in the October wind. White sheets in the November cold. Indifferent to the calendar, indifferent to the progress of a war being fought 4,000 miles away, snapping with the same clean sound they had made in August. Werner Haas had been at Camp Hearn for 4 months by the time the last leaves came down. He had been conducting his audit for all 4 of those months, adding entries to the ledger in his head with the systematic attention of an engineer who understands that individual data points are only as valuable as the pattern they collectively describe. The pattern had been describing itself with increasing clarity since August. By November, it was not a pattern he was inferring. It was a pattern he was reading. He worked in the laundry facility each morning and thought while he worked, which is one of the advantages of physical work that does not require full cognitive engagement. It leaves the mind free to go where it needs to go while the hands do what they are trained to do. He operated the Maytag machines. He monitored the water temperatures. He counted loads and calculated throughput and compared the results to everything he knew about German military logistics, which was considerable, and the comparison produced the same result each time he ran it. The throughput at Camp Hearn's laundry facility, for 4,800 prisoners, using equipment that was surplus to American war production requirements, exceeded the laundry capacity of his entire division during the North Africa campaign. He added this to the ledger. He added the food waste from the kitchen, which he had calculated from the meal provisions and the realistic consumption rates, and which produced a daily surplus of caloric value exceeding the weekly rations of a German frontline infantry unit. He added the electrical consumption of the facility, which was continuous, unrationed, running 24 hours a day to power lights and machines and water heating and refrigeration and every other system that required electricity, drawing on a grid that had been built to serve a civilian population accustomed to electricity as a utility rather than a ration resource. He added the trucks. Every morning, supply trucks arrived at Camp Hearn's receiving dock. Trucks, not horse carts, not trains, not the improvised transport that characterized German logistics at the point when the fuel calculations had become unfavorable. American trucks, running on American fuel on American roads, delivering American supplies to American prisoner of war camps in quantities that treated adequacy as a floor rather than a ceiling. He kept adding entries. The ledger filled. Tobias appeared at the laundry facility door one October morning with the soil of his grounds maintenance assignment still on his boots, wanting to talk. "Novak showed me the kitchen disposal," he said. Werner kept folding. "I know about it. They throw away food, Werner. Actual food, not just peels. Bread ends, meat trimmings, vegetables that are slightly past their best. They put it in bins and a farmer collects it twice a week for his pigs. I know. I've calculated the quantities. In Sicily, we were making soup from potato peels. I know that also." Tobias came inside and sat on the wooden bench along the wall, in the spot he usually occupied when he came to the laundry facility to think, which had become a regular occurrence since September. "How do you think about it all?" he said. "All of it together. Without it becoming—" He stopped. "Without it becoming what?" "Without it changing everything." Werner set down the sheet he was folding and looked at the young pilot on the bench. He was 21 years old and had the specific quality of someone whose understanding of the world was undergoing a structural revision, the kind of revision that happens not through argument but through accumulation, when enough individual pieces have arrived that the previous structure can no longer accommodate them all. Werner said, "It is changing everything. That's not something to resist. That's something to understand. What do you do with it? When it's changed everything." Werner picked up the sheet and resumed folding. "You find out what remains," he said. "After the change. You find out what you still know that is true, and you build from there." Tobias considered this for a moment. What remains? Werner thought about his engineering training, about the principles that did not change depending on what material was available or what the supply situation was, about the fundamental relationships between load and support, between capacity and demand, between what a system could produce and what it was being asked to produce. He said, "More than you think. Less than you believed." Tobias nodded slowly. He sat with this for a while. Then he got up and went back to his grounds maintenance, and Werner went back to the machines, and the hot water moved through the copper pipes with its steady sound, and the morning continued. He took Grauer on the tour in November. He found the Hauptmann outside the administration building one morning, standing with his hands behind his back in the posture of a man, maintaining a position under pressure that the position does not acknowledge, and said, "Come with me. There's something I want you to see." Grauer came because Grauer was not a man who refused engagement. His ideology was confrontational rather than avoidant. He believed in argument. He believed that argument could be won. They started in the laundry facility. Werner walked him through the operation with the systematic thoroughness of an engineer conducting a site assessment. The 6 Maytag machines. Their provenance, which Werner explained with specificity. Manufactured in Newton, Iowa, by a company that had converted its production lines to aircraft component manufacturing and had these machines left over. The water supply, the detergent storage, the throughput calculations. He cited numbers. He pointed at fittings. He demonstrated the machine cycle on an active load. He explained the supply chain that kept the detergent stocked without rationing. Grauer listened with his hands behind his back and the expression of a man waiting for the weakness in the argument. From the laundry facility they went to the kitchen's disposal area. Werner lifted a lid on one of the 3 large collection bins outside the back wall. Potato peelings, bread ends, vegetable trimmings, meat scraps. The daily overflow from a mess operation calibrated for maximum consumption and indifferent to the gap between maximum and actual. The caloric value in a single bin, Werner estimated quietly, exceeded the weekly rations of a German frontline infantry unit in the winter campaigns of 1942. The farmer comes Tuesdays and Thursdays, Werner said. He uses it for feed. Grauer looked at the bin and said nothing. From the kitchen they went to the medical facility. Werner had been there twice for the standard intake examinations and had documented its contents with the same attention he applied to everything. An examination room with equipment that would not have been out of place in a civilian clinic. An X-ray machine. Stocks of sulfa drugs in quantities that a German field hospital commander in Tunisia would have considered remarkable. A dentist's chair. Surgical instruments properly sterilized and stored. For prisoners of war. Werner stood in the doorway and let Grauer look at the room. Then he said, without heat, in the level voice of a man reporting an observation. My regiment had 1 medic for every 80 men in Tunisia. He ran out of morphine in February of 1943. We had wounded men with no pain management for the last 3 months of the campaign. Grauer looked at the medical facility. Werner said, if Germany is winning this war, why do its prisoners eat better than its soldiers ate in the field? He asked it as an engineer asks about a calculation that does not balance. Not as an accusation. Not as a challenge to Grauer's beliefs or to his identity or to anything except the arithmetic. Just the question put into the air, where it would either find an answer or it wouldn't. The silence that followed was long enough that Werner knew it wouldn't. Margaret's sister had been killed in the July raids. Operation Gamara, the Americans were calling it, a name that the biblical reference rendered appropriately enormous. The sister had been in her apartment in the Hammerbrook district when the firestorm came through. She had not been able to get out. The house was intact. They were in it. There was no heating fuel. There was no coal. There was a ration for coal that was not always fulfilled. She had been burning furniture, the wooden chairs first, then the table from the back bedroom. The boys wore shoes she had made from wood and canvas because there was no leather and no rubber and nothing else available from which shoes could be made. She asked whether he was being treated well. She said she hoped he was safe. She said she thought of him every morning when she woke up and every evening when she put the boys to bed, and that the boys asked about him and she told them he was far away and would come back when the war was finished, which she told them with the conviction she could manage, which was sometimes more and sometimes less. Eric read the letter twice in the barracks. Then he folded it along its existing creases, carefully, the way you handle paper that has to last a long time, and put it in the pocket of his uniform jacket and walked to the laundry facility, where Werner was finishing the morning's work. He sat on the bench. Werner turned off the machine he was monitoring. He sat beside Eric. Not close enough to crowd him. Close enough to be there. The building was warm. The machines had been running all morning and the heat of the water and the motors had accumulated in the space, making it warmer than the January Texas air outside. The copper pipes ticked and settled. Through the high windows the sky was the pale flat blue of winter in central Texas. After a while Eric said, Margaret's sister is dead. Werner said nothing. The boys are alive. He said this with a quality that was not quite relief, because relief would have required that the alternative had been possible without being certain, and the 7 months of silence had moved the alternative past possibility into the territory where it had simply been waited for. The boys being alive was the resolution of 7 months of suspended dread. It was not a surprise. It was what he had been holding the silence against, the thing he had been refusing to process as fact until he had confirmation either way. "She's made them shoes," Eric said. "Wood and canvas. Because there's nothing else." Werner looked at his hands in his lap. He thought about the camp kitchen's disposal bins. He thought about the daily overflow from the mess operation, the food that was produced in quantities calibrated for maximum consumption and that exceeded actual consumption by enough that it had to be collected and removed. He thought about the detergent storage room in the laundry facility, fully stocked, with no indication of the rationing that would have applied had the supply been insufficient for the demand. He thought about the medical facility with its sulfa drugs and its X-ray machine and its dentist's chair. He thought about a woman in Hamburg making shoes from wood and canvas because that was what there was. Eric put the letter back in his pocket. The uniform jacket was clean. It had been washed Monday and returned Wednesday, pressed and folded, as it was every week, as it would continue to be every week for as long as the camp operated, because the operation of the laundry was not a question of whether resources were available. The resources were available. The laundry was a standard function of the facility, and the facility maintained its standards. Eric looked at his hands. He said, "I am a prisoner of my enemy. I am safer than my children. I eat more than my wife. I wear clean clothes. I have a bar of soap that is mine alone." He was quiet for a moment. "What is the name for what that is?" Werner thought about this for a long time. He said, "I don't think there is one." They sat in the warm building and listened to the pipes settle, and outside the Texas winter continued its mild and indifferent progress. And somewhere in Hamburg a woman was burning furniture to keep 2 boys warm. The roof of the laundry facility developed a leak in December. A section of flashing along the north wall had separated slightly from the roofline, creating a gap that admitted water when it rained. The water ran down the interior wall and collected in a small puddle on the concrete floor. It did not reach the machines. It did not affect the facility's operation. It was a minor defect in the building envelope, the kind of thing that develops in any structure subject to weather over time, requiring modest attention and modest materials to correct. Werner reported it to Novak through the standard maintenance reporting process, which was the procedure. The following morning, a crew of 4 American workers arrived at the laundry facility with roofing materials. Werner watched from the barracks window across the compound. They were not military. They were civilian contract workers, the kind of men employed in maintenance and construction, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who repair roofs regularly and for whom the sequence of steps is automatic. Old flashing removed with tin snips. New flashing cut from roll stock, fitted, pressed into the roofline angle, sealed at the seam with compound applied from a caulking gun. New shingles in the disturbed area, nailed and seated. The crew worked without consulting each other about the next step, because there was no need to consult. They knew what came next. The whole operation took 6 hours. Werner watched from the barracks window and did not move for a long time after the cruise truck had left. He thought about his unit in North Africa in the winter of 1942. They had requested a replacement radio. The original had been damaged in an artillery barrage, not destroyed but impaired, functional only intermittently in a role where intermittent function was the same as no function, because the difference between receiving an order and not receiving it was not a matter of degree. They had completed the paperwork. They had submitted the request through the appropriate channels with the appropriate documentation. They had followed the process that existed for the replacement of damaged equipment. The replacement had arrived 6 weeks later. Werner sat on his bunk and held the 2 facts next to each other. 6 weeks for a radio that soldiers needed. 6 hours for a roof repair on a building used to wash prisoners' laundry. He was not angry. He was not indignant. Anger would have required him to believe that the disproportion was wrong, a deviation from how things should be. He had stopped believing that. What he was a man in possession of a very clear measurement, one of the clearest he had taken since arriving at Camp Hearn, because this one did not require calculation. It was simply 2 numbers. 6 weeks. 6 hours. He added it to the ledger. You cannot sustain a display at this scale. You cannot coordinate the roof repair crews and the detergent supply and the mess hall provisions and the medical facility and the hot water and all the other elements of Camp Hearn's operation as a psychological campaign without the coordination itself becoming more evidence than the thing you are trying to display. You can only sustain a fact. Camp Hearn was a fact. The roof repair was a fact. The Maytag machines were a fact. Werner had been adding facts to his ledger since August, and the ledger had reached a conclusion that was no longer available for revision. The camp administration provided a Christmas tree, a real cedar, brought in and set up in the compound's common area. Decorations. Through the commissary supply, which operated on the same principle of adequacy as a baseline that governed everything else at Camp Hearn. Ingredients for traditional German holiday baking. Flour, butter, sugar, eggs, the spices that the recipes required. Adequate quantities, simply available, the provision of normalcy as a standard function. The prisoners organized the baking themselves. Werner worked alongside Tobias at a long table in the barracks common room, mixing the dough for Stollen, the traditional German Christmas bread with its dense texture and its particular combination of dried fruit and marzipan, and the sugar dusting on the outside that his mother had applied with the specific practiced motion of someone who has made the same thing many times. He did not have his mother's recipe. He was working from memory and from the collective memory of the other men at the table, a composite recipe assembled from individual recollections that converged on something close to the thing being remembered. Tobias worked beside him, 21 years old, focused on the task with the engagement of a young man who has found something simple and real to do with his hands. He laughed at something one of the older prisoners said at the far end of the table. The laugh was uncomplicated, the kind that happens when something genuinely strikes a person as funny and there is no particular reason not to express it. Eric sat at the edge of the group and watched. He did not participate in the making of the bread. He watched with the specific quality of attention that means someone is storing something against future need, committing something to memory because memory is what survives when the experience itself cannot. Werner held a piece of the finished Stollen when it came from the improvised oven the men had constructed from available materials. He turned it in his hands. American flour, milled from American grain, grown on American land, transported by American trucks, issued from an American commissary, baked by German prisoners in an American prisoner of war camp in Central Texas, assembled into the shape and approximate taste of something his mother made every December in a kitchen in Stuttgart that no longer had the supplies to make it. He took a bite. The taste was correct. Not perfect, not the exact taste of memory, but correct in the way that a copy made from understanding rather than reproduction is correct. It has the essential proportions right even if the individual details are approximate. Tobias watched him. "What are you thinking?" Tobias said. Werner considered how to answer this honestly. He said, "I'm thinking that this bread tastes correct. The recipe is correct. The result is what it should be. And that means the ingredients are correct. And that means the kitchen that supplied the ingredients is correct." He paused. "And I came here believing the kitchen was broken." Tobias held the bread in his hand. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, simply and without drama, "It isn't broken." "No," Werner said. "Ours is." Werner said nothing. The statement was accurate. There was nothing to add to an accurate statement, and adding things to accurate statements for the purpose of softening them was a habit he had decided, somewhere in the previous months, to stop. Tobias looked at the bread in his hand for a moment. Then he ate it. He ate it with the full attention of a 22-year-old eating something that tasted like Christmas, and something changed in his face as he chewed, something that moved through him and settled, the way that something shifts in a structure when it finds the configuration it will hold. Werner watched this happen and recognized it. It was the specific expression of a person who has made a decision without words. Not about the war or about Germany or about any of the large things that were beyond deciding. About himself. About what he intended to do next. About the fact that there would be a next and that he was going to be in it, and that being in it was something he had decided to treat as a project rather than as a circumstance. Tobias Wren, eating Stollen in a prisoner of war camp on Christmas 1943, had decided to survive. Not just the war. Everything that came after. Werner thought, good. January 1944 arrived without ceremony. The machines ran on Mondays. The clean laundry came back on Wednesdays. The meals appeared at correct times in correct quantities. The medical facility maintained its supplies. Novak did his rounds with the unhurried efficiency of a man operating a system that functions because it has been built to function and is maintained to that standard. Werner stood at the barracks window one January morning and looked at the white sheets on the clotheslines in the winter light, and understood with the finality of a calculation that has been checked and rechecked and produces the same result each time, that the picture he had been assembling since August was complete. Germany had not lost the war because of tactics, not because of bad generals or bad luck or bad weather, though all of these had contributed. Germany had lost because it had entered a contest of arithmetic against an opponent whose arithmetic it had fundamentally and fatally miscalculated. The production, the logistics, the supply chains, the Maytag machines, the roofers who arrived the next morning and fixed a leak in 6 hours. These were not advantages. They were the ordinary function of a system that had not yet been required to strain. Werner had been straining for years. He had come from a world of strain and arrived in a world of ordinary function and had spent 5 months measuring the distance between them. The distance was the war. He turned from the window and walked to the laundry facility and opened the doors and started the first machine of the morning. Hot water came immediately. Steady pressure. Correct temperature. The copper pipes held. They always held. Spring came to Robertson County in the way that spring comes to flat land. Not with drama, not with the visible topographic change that marks seasonal shift in mountainous country, but with accumulation, with the quiet addition of warmth to warmth until the sum is something different from what it was. The light changed first. It arrived through the barracks windows at a lower angle in the morning, catching the dust in the air and making it visible, which created the impression that the air itself had changed when what had changed was the light's relationship to the air. Then the temperature, moving upward by degrees so gradual that the transition was only visible in retrospect, in the moment when Werner realized he had stopped needing the issued wool blanket at night. Then the land, the flat Robertson County earth softening at the edges of the compound perimeter. Small green things appearing along the fence line and in the gaps between the buildings where seeds had settled over the winter. Werner noticed all of it with the attention he had been applying to everything at Camp Hearn since August. Not with sentiment. With the trained observational habit of an engineer for whom the world is data and data is the basis of understanding, and understanding is the only reliable foundation for anything that comes next. He had been at Camp Hearn for 8 months. He had been conducting his audit for 8 months, and the audit was complete, and the conclusion was settled, and what he was doing now was not continuing to build the picture but continuing to live inside it, which is a different thing and requires different resources. He understood now. Not in the preliminary way of someone who has just grasped something for the first time. In the settled way of someone who has grasped something, examined it from every available angle, found no reason to revise it, and has now incorporated it into the structure of how they see. He went to the laundry facility in the mornings and operated the machines and folded the clean sheets and distributed the clean laundry, and his mind, freed from the work of building the understanding, was available for other things. He thought about Stuttgart. He thought about his mother's kitchen and the particular angle of afternoon light through the window above the sink. He thought about his engineering work before the war, the projects he had been part of, the satisfaction of a design that performed as intended. He thought about what it might mean to do that work again, in a Germany that was going to be whatever it was going to be on the other side of whatever came next. He thought about Tobias Wren eating stolen and deciding to survive. He thought, that is the right decision. Make it correctly and make it every day. News arrived at Camp Hearn through the channels that news arrives through in any closed population. New prisoners carrying information from more recent experience. Newspapers circulated until they fell apart at the fold lines. Radio transmissions from the armed forces broadcasts that leaked through walls and windows when conditions were favorable. By the spring of 1944, the pattern was clear. By the summer, it was undeniable. By autumn, it was simply what was true. The Reich was in retreat on every front simultaneously, the Eastern Front compressing westward under Soviet pressure, the Italian campaign pushing northward, the Normandy landing in June having created a fourth axis of pressure that the German defensive capacity could not accommodate. Werner received this information without surprise and without satisfaction. He had completed his arithmetic in January. The news from Europe was the arithmetic confirming itself in the events that arithmetic had implied were coming. He was not watching Germany lose. He was watching the ledger total itself. Tobias received the same information differently. He was 22 by the time the Normandy news arrived, and he processed the news the way a young man processes information that threatens the structure he has just decided to build on, with attention, with acknowledgement of its implications, and with the specific determination of someone who has decided that the determination will not be revised regardless of what the information contains. He had made his decision at Christmas. The decision held. Werner watched him read the newspaper accounts of the Normandy landings, passing the paper from hand to hand with the other men in his barracks, and saw in his face the same expression he had seen over the stolen. Settled. Not happy. Not unhappy. Settled in the way of someone who has found the configuration they intend to hold. The news about Stuttgart reached Camp Herne in late September. It came through a new prisoner who had been through the city 2 weeks before his capture in France, a young soldier who carried the information in the way that people carry information about disasters they have witnessed, with excessive detail in some places and complete blankness in others, because that is how the mind accommodates things that are too large for its ordinary processing. The Zuffenhausen district. The industrial facilities, parts of the center. The bombing campaign's logic was not personal. It was the logic of industrial targeting applied to a city with the concentration of precision manufacturing that Stuttgart had. Werner had understood this logic for months. Understanding the logic did not change what the logic had produced. He went back to his barracks after the conversation and sat on his bunk. He held the address of his mother's apartment in his mind with the precision of something memorized by necessity. The street name, the building number, the floor. He ran through it as if the precision of recall might function as protection for the place itself. He knew it did not work that way. He held it anyway. He did not go to the laundry facility that afternoon. That evening Novak came through the barracks on his regular round. He moved at the same pace he always moved, stopping at each barracks in sequence, checking the facility with the thoroughness of a man who understands that maintenance is not an event but a habit. He stopped at Werner's bunk. He looked at Werner for a moment. He did not say anything about Stuttgart. He set a tin cup of coffee on the small table beside the bunk, real coffee from the mess hall supply, and walked on. Werner looked at the cup for a long time. It was not sympathy exactly. Sympathy is one person extending toward another the understanding of what they are experiencing. This was something more precise and less personal than sympathy. It was the application of the standard to a circumstance the standard had not been specifically designed for. The standard said that a man in this facility received adequate provision. Adequate provision included coffee in the evening. The fact that the man's city was burning 4,000 miles away was not a variable in the standard. The standard applied regardless. Werner drank the coffee. It was exactly what it always was. He thought, that is the point. That is the entire point. May 8, 1945. The news arrived through Armed Forces radio, clearly and without ambiguity. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Werner heard it from the man in the next bunk, who had heard it from the door, who had heard it from the radio transmission coming through the open window of the administration building, and the information moved through Camp Herne in the way that enormous things move through closed populations, in all directions simultaneously, arriving at different people at different moments, producing responses across the full range of what people feel when something they have been living inside for years suddenly ends. Some men wept. Some stood in the compound in the May afternoon and looked at nothing in particular for a long time. Some retreated to their bunks and faced the wall. Some, the ones who had decided months or years ago that the outcome was what it was going to be, received the news with the equanimity of people for whom confirmation is different from surprise. Werner went outside. The compound in the May afternoon was the compound it had always been. The barracks, the fence line with its clotheslines, the recreation area, the administrative buildings, the laundry facility with its corrugated metal roof, all of it exactly as it had been this morning and yesterday and every day for the previous 21 months. The sheets were on the clotheslines, moving in the May wind. Grauer stood alone near the eastern fence, facing the wire. Werner looked at him from across the compound. The distance was enough that Grauer's expression was not fully readable, but the posture was the specific posture of a structure that has failed at its load-bearing point. Not collapsed dramatically, settled. The irreversible settling of something that has been under load too long and has now found a new configuration that is permanent and lower than the previous one. Werner did not cross the compound toward him. There was nothing to say that the situation did not already say more completely than any words could. He found Tobias standing in the middle of the open area with his face tilted slightly toward the sky. Not weeping, not performing any particular response. Simply breathing in the deliberate way of someone who is paying attention to breathing, because paying attention to breathing is the most honest thing available to do in a moment that is too large for any more complex response. Werner stood beside him. After a while, Tobias said, "We're going home." Werner said, "Yes. To whatever is there." "Yes." Tobias lowered his face from the sky. He was 22 years old. He had spent 2 years at Camp Hearn becoming, without intending it as a project, someone who was capable of what came next. The capability was not dramatic. It was the accumulated result of 800 days of adjusting his understanding of how the world worked, day by day, piece of evidence by piece of evidence, until the understanding had restructured itself into something that could accommodate the reality rather than requiring the reality to accommodate it. Werner looked at him and said nothing. Some things are smaller when you speak them than when you leave them as what they are. Novak crossed the compound with his hands in his pockets and stopped near them and looked at the Texas sky for a moment. "Hell of a day," he said. "Yes," Werner said. Novak looked at both of them. He had the expression of a man with something further to say who is taking the time to determine whether saying it is useful. Then he said, "I hope it's not as bad as they're telling us it is." He walked on. Werner stood in the May afternoon and let Camp Hearn be around him for a moment. The machines, the pipes, the butter, the sheets, the repaired roof, the sulfa drugs, the coffee set on a table beside a bunk on a September evening without comment or explanation, the baseball in Novak's hand, the standard applied without exception and without ceremony, because the standard was the standard. He went back to the laundry facility and folded the afternoon's load. Werner left Camp Hearn in December 1945, transported east by rail to New York and then by ship across the Atlantic that he had crossed twice before, once westward in captivity and now eastward toward whatever remained. He stood at the ship's stern on the December crossing and watched the American coast recede into the winter haze, and he thought about what he was carrying back with him. Not the issued clothing or the few objects that had accumulated over 21 months. The other things, the measurement, the audit completed. The picture assembled from individual pieces over the course of 21 months in a facility that functioned because functioning was the standard. The Atlantic in December was gray and cold and without sentiment about anything occurring on its surface. He arrived in Stuttgart in January 1946. He had been building his understanding of what he would find since September, assembling it from fragments brought in by new prisoners and from the arithmetic of what the bombing campaign had been doing and from the logic of what happens to a city's infrastructure when its industrial capacity has been the primary target of sustained aerial attack. The building of understanding had prepared him the way that building of understanding always prepares you, partially and imperfectly, and not nearly enough for the moment of actual arrival. He walked from the processing center through streets that required navigation by what remained rather than by what should have been there. The Stiftskirch steeple was still standing and he used it as a reference. He used the hills to the east unchanged, permanent in the way that geography is permanent when everything built on it is not. He used memory, which is the most unreliable navigation but sometimes the only kind available. He found his mother in the building where Margaret's letter had indicated she would be, 2 rooms on the 3rd floor, windows covered with boards and then with a combination of boards and cardboard where boards had run out, shared water supply in the ground floor hallway, a cold tap that served 6 families in the various intact apartments in what remained of the building, a small stove that burned whatever could be burned, which in January was not much, because the coal ration was inconsistent and what supplemented it had to be found rather than purchased. She was 61 years old and the war had done what the war does. Extracted something and replaced it with something harder and less warm but more durable, the specific exchange that people who survive very difficult things receive whether they have agreed to it or not. She looked at him in the doorway for a long moment. Then she held out her arms and he walked into them and they stood in the cold room for a long time without speaking, and the cold and the rubble visible through the boarded window and the 6 families sharing the water tap were all true and none of them were as true as the standing and the silence. When they separated she looked at his face. "You're heavier," she said. "I was fed," he said. "Were they decent to you?" Werner stood in the cold room of the damaged building in the damaged city and thought about the Maytag machines from Newton, Iowa. He thought about the butter at breakfast, unrationed. He thought about the roof repaired in 6 hours, the sulfa drugs, the coffee set beside his bunk on a September evening when his city had begun to burn. He thought about Novak's 3 words. He thought about his mother's hands in the hallway, scrubbing fabric against itself in cold water with soap made from ash, because that was what there was. He said, "They were decent." He did not say more. The full account of his 21 months at Camp Hearn, the 3,400 calories and the Maytag machines and the clean laundry on Wednesdays, was not something he could give her without it costing her something she had no resources to pay. He was standing in a room where there was no heat and no real soap and no assured food supply, speaking to a woman who had managed all of this alone for 3 years. The accurate account of his captivity was a luxury that the room could not accommodate. He sat down and asked her what needed to be done. She told him. There was a list. He began. The winters of 1946 and 1947 tested everything. Coal was scarce throughout the city. The supply chains that had once moved goods through the urban infrastructure had been interrupted by the destruction of the infrastructure itself, and their reconstruction was a problem of logistics and materials and coordination that could not be solved quickly regardless of the goodwill applied to it. Families burned furniture. They traded objects from before the war for food and fuel. They made calculations daily about the relationship between what they had and what they needed, and the calculations rarely resolved in their favor. Werner worked. He cleared rubble. He made repairs with available materials which were not the materials a repair correctly done would require, and he made the repairs as well as the materials allowed, because that was what the situation permitted, and he was not in the habit of withholding his best effort from a situation because the situation was less than ideal. He found work as a draftsman with a small engineering firm attempting to reconstruct its operations from what had survived. The pay was inadequate by any pre-war standard and reasonable by the standard of what the economy could support in 1946. He took it and did the work and used the income for what the income could provide, which was not enough and was better than nothing. He thought about Camp Hearn when the calculations were worst. Not with longing. Not with the specific nostalgia for a place that had been comfortable when the present place was not. With the calibrated attention of an engineer using a reference point. When the available materials were inadequate for the required repair, he thought about the distance between where he was and where the Maytag machines were, and he converted that distance into a measurement of what was possible in principle, a measurement of a gap that was real but not permanent, that could be closed with time and work and the application of the skills he had. He wrote to Tobias twice in 1946. The reply came from Augsburg, where Tobias had found his family alive and was enrolled in an engineering program on a scholarship organized through the Allied Reconstruction Assistance. The letter was brief and direct, written in the style of a young man who has a great deal to do and is not spending any of his available time on sentences that do not carry weight. "We are building," he wrote. "It is slow, but it is real. I think about Texas sometimes. Come to Munich when you can." Werner kept the letter. He wrote to Eric through the address he had been given at the repatriation processing. The reply took 6 months and came from Hamburg. Eric had found Margaret and both sons. The older boy, who had worn the shoes of wood and canvas, was 11 now and had almost no memory of his father. The younger was 9 and remembered less. Eric wrote with the specific careful restraint of a man describing a situation that contains more pain than the words he has chosen are equipped to carry. He said, "It takes time." He said, "They are beginning to know me again." He said, "Margaret sends her regards." Werner wrote back. He said, "I am glad you found them." He said, "Time is what we have and we were told we had lost it and here it is anyway." Grauer returned to Munich and was not heard from publicly. His son, in a private account written in 1978 and kept within the family, recorded that his father had purchased the first electric washing machine to reach the West German consumer market in the early 1950s. He had paid for it from his monthly income without comment about why he was spending that amount of money on that particular object. He had installed it in the apartment himself. After that, he had operated it every Monday morning, without variation, through the remainder of his life. Not because the Monday load required it, because Monday was when it ran. The son wrote that he had never understood this. Werner, reading the account years later at the invitation of Grauer's son, who had located him through the network that former Camp Hearn prisoners had formed over the decades, understood exactly what it meant. Grauer had made the same measurement Werner had made in the same facility from the same evidence. He had simply never found a way to speak it, and so he had enacted it, every Monday morning, in the only language that was available to a man who had decided not to open his mouth on the subject. Werner respected this. It was not what he would have chosen, but he understood it. Werner bought his Maytag in the spring of 1952. He had been looking for a Maytag specifically since the previous autumn, when the West German import market had begun to carry American appliances in quantities that made the search realistic. He corresponded with an import firm in Frankfurt. He waited several months for the specific model to become available. He waited with the patience of a man who has learned that the thing he is looking for is worth waiting for, and that the waiting is not wasted time but simply the interval between the intention and its fulfillment. The machine arrived in March. He installed it himself in the apartment he shared with his mother, who was 72 years old now and had outlasted everything the war had sent against her, and was still present in her rooms with the durable quality that the war had installed in her in exchange for what it had taken, available for what remained of ordinary life. He connected the hot water supply line. He checked the fitting at the connection point. It was correctly made. Clean solder joint, proper alignment, no irregularity in the seal. He placed a load of white sheets in the drum. He measured the detergent and added it. He turned the machine on. His mother stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. The machine filled with hot water. The drum began to turn. The sound of it was the sound of Camp Hearn, the same machine operating in the same way, and for a moment Werner was 28 years old standing in the laundry facility in the Texas heat, his hand on the enamel, understanding for the first time what the machine represented and what that representation meant about the war he had been fighting and the arithmetic that had governed its outcome. "It's loud," his mother said. "It works," Werner said. She came and stood beside him in front of the machine, and they watched the drum turn through the glass door, the white sheets moving against each other in the hot water in the clean and unambiguous way of things that are performing their designed function within their designed parameters. After a while she said, "Is this what it was like? Where you were?" He thought about how to answer. "This is part of what it was like," he said. "And the rest?" He watched the drum turn. "The rest is why I bought this machine," he said. She stood beside him a little longer. Then she put her hand on the machine's enamel surface. It was warm from the water inside it. "It's real," she said. "Yes," Werner said. "It is." She went back to the kitchen. Werner stood alone in front of the machine and watched the cycle complete. Germany had fought with everything it had. That was not a failure of courage or of engineering or of will. It was a failure of arithmetic. America had fought with a fraction of what it had and maintained the rest as ordinary life. Butter at breakfast, copper fittings done correctly the first time, roofs repaired promptly, laundry returned clean and pressed on Wednesdays. Not as generosity, not as display, as the visible surface of a system that was not straining. Werner had measured that surface for 21 months, entry by entry, and the measurement had never changed, and the machine he bought in 1952 was the measurement made permanent. He ran it every Monday so he would not forget what the numbers said. The cycle finished. The drum stopped. Werner opened the machine and removed the sheets. They were hot and clean and smelled of real detergent and machine warmth. The smell he had not encountered since December 1945, when he had folded the last load of Camp Hearn laundry before his repatriation transport began. He held the sheets for a moment. Then he began to fold them. He pressed the edge straight with his palm, the way he had been doing it since August 1943, the physical habit of 21 months operating in his hands without requiring instruction from any other part of him. He set the folded sheet on the stack and started on the next one. Werner Haas lived in Stuttgart until 1991, when he moved to a smaller apartment in the Vehingen district, closer to his daughter's family. He had worked as a mechanical engineer for 30 years, part of the generation that built the Wirtschaftswunder out of the rubble and the reckoning, applying to West Germany's reconstruction the same trained attention he had applied to every problem he had ever been given. He retired in 1982 at 67 and spent the years after doing what engineers do in retirement, maintaining things, assessing things, fixing what could be fixed with the skills and the standards that do not retire when the professional designation does. He ran the Maytag until 1971, when its motor required a replacement part that was no longer manufactured. He replaced it with a Mila, which was German-made and well-engineered and which he operated for 20 more years. He kept the Maytag in the utility room of the Vehingen apartment when he moved there, in the corner under the window, not connected to anything. His daughter asked him why he kept a machine that didn't run. He told her it was well-made, which was true. It was not the complete answer. The complete answer was that it was a measurement. A fixed reference point in the physical world, the same kind of reference point that engineers establish at the beginning of any long-term project, the stable datum against which all subsequent measurements are taken. Some things cannot be discarded without losing the accuracy that they represent. Werner understood this professionally and had applied it personally, and the machine in the corner of the utility room was the evidence of that application. Every Monday morning, without variation, he did his laundry. He measured the detergent with the precision of a man for whom measurement is not anxiety but accuracy, and accuracy is the foundation of everything that works. He watched the drum turn. He thought, sometimes, about the white sheets snapping on the clotheslines at Camp Hearn in the August wind, the sound they made, the color of them in the Texas sun, the specific message they had delivered to a 28-year-old man standing on a railway platform in Robertson County, who had arrived prepared for brutality and received, instead, evidence. He thought about Novak's 3 words, which he had turned over so many times across so many decades that they had become smooth, like stones carried in a river until they lose their edges and reveal their essential shape. Because we can. Not a boast. Not a declaration. A simple statement of the relationship between capacity and behavior, the most honest thing Werner had heard anyone say in the entire duration of the war. He thought about Tobias Wren, who had become an aeronautical engineer and had worked on the design of civilian aircraft and had sent Werner a photograph of himself standing in front of a completed aircraft on a tarmac in Hamburg in 1965, with a handwritten note on the back, "We built it." Werner had kept the photograph in the desk drawer where he kept important things. He thought about Eric Sommer, who had rebuilt his relationship with his sons year by careful year, who had sent Christmas cards every December until 1989 when a brief note from Margaret had arrived instead, informing Werner of Eric's death in October, peacefully in Hamburg at 71. Werner had written back to Margaret. He had kept writing to her until his own health made correspondence difficult. He folded the last sheet on a Monday morning in the autumn of his 83rd year, in the Vehingen apartment, with his daughter's voice in the room beyond and the morning light coming through the window at the angle that said the day was still early and there was time. He folded it precisely, pressing the edge straight with his palm corners aligned, the habit of 21 months active in his hands after 60 years in the way that certain habits are active, without requiring thought, simply as the body's memory of what it learned when learning was what was happening. He set it on the stack. He looked at the stack of clean white folded sheets on the table in the morning light. He thought, I was 28 years old on a railway platform in Texas, and I held a khaki uniform to my face and smelled real soap, and something that I had believed without examination broke cleanly, and was replaced by something I had examined in every detail and knew was accurate. I spent the next 21 months measuring the accuracy. I spent the 60 years after that building on what the measurement had shown. He thought, this is what a measurement is for. He thought, this is what survives. He went to make coffee. It was exactly what it always was, which was the point, which had always been the point, from the first morning in the mess hall when the butter was simply there, unrationed, available, the ordinary margin of a country that had not yet been required to strain. He measured the coffee. He waited for the water. He poured it carefully. Outside the Vehingen apartment, the city went about its Monday morning, the city that had been rubble in January 1946 and was now simply Stuttgart again, a city where things were maintained and the infrastructure held and the standards were applied without ceremony because they were the standards, which meant they did not require explanation, only adherence. Werner Haas drank his coffee. He thought of nothing in particular. He was 83 years old, and the morning was early, and the sheets were folded, and the measurement was accurate. That was enough. That had always been enough.